tech as a whole. I think that we need a lot more focus, a lot more investment into technological assessment, right? What is going on with these technologies? What is their likely impact actually going to be? And then how does that inform how we respond to them as a public, but also how governments can respond to them, instead of, just having this common narrative that, the government can't keep up, it doesn't have the expertise. The government can build that expertise in order to be able to properly respond to technologies, in order to regulate them properly. And I think that's something that we need a lot more of.
Thank you so much to the Toronto Public Library for having us, and thank you to everyone who's in the audience for joining us live. You've heard that Paris is a tech critic, and just as we kick off, I want to disclose that I am a proud financial supporter, very modestly, of Tech Won't Save Us, and also that I receive advice, non-binding advice from Paris at the McMaster Master of Public Policy program, which does not mean that the questions are going to be total softballs. I just want to get into the habit of disclosing these things and talking about them. Tonight, we're talking about the $100 billion bet on getting robots to be able to turn left, and whether and when we're going to walk away from that, what it says about us as a civil society, as innovators, and what it means to think critically about ambitious plans that we're investing a lot in. As Cory Doctorow has said, whatever you think you know about autonomous vehicle success is just spin, hype, and he actually used the word bullshit. So we'll talk about whether Cory was right there. We're going to be discussing the book together for about 40 minutes, and then I'm turning the tables, I'm taking a break, I'm drinking this water, and we want to hear from you. So please be primed with your questions ahead of the book signing, so we can hear from you as well. To kick off, the kickoff question is always a bit of don't hold it against me, but you joined us here in Toronto on Sunday. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you've been getting around the city?
Yeah, of course. Mainly by subway and with my feet. I've taken the streetcars before. I don't think I've taken buses in Toronto before, but I enjoy the subway system. It's pretty nice.
Bus is an experience too, if you can fit it in.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, so tell us more about this future that we were quote unquote promised. We were also talking about futures that we were promised when we spoke about John Lawrence's book, the history of dreaming, about urban utopias, and Josh O'Kane's book on Sidewalk Labs. We talked about dreaming sideways. So, the frictionless cities, electric personal vehicles, solar panels. Tell us more about that dream, because something that's so fantastic about the book is that it's historical too. It's not just about the last kind of 20 years. You're also kind of putting these ambitions in context.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the question. Thanks so much for, hosting this, of course. Thanks for everyone for coming. I think it's really interesting, right? Because for the past 10 or 15 years, we've had this kind of narrative, right? The tech companies have wanted us to know that they were disrupting society. They were going to disrupt how we get around. They were really going to radically alter and change our cities, our transportation systems. And I think when we look at how we get around today and we compare it to 15 years ago, probably doesn't look a whole lot different. And if it does, it's not because of a tech company. It's not because of Google or Uber or one of these. Sure, maybe you can hail a taxi from your phone now, but is that really so different from calling one up or hailing one down on the street? I don't think that makes a huge difference to how we get around. And so a lot of these tech companies identified that there are real problems in the transportation system, right? People spend too much time stuck in traffic. Getting around can be expensive. People die on the roads, and we need to address that. And there's a massive contribution to climate change that comes from our transportation system. And so they saw these real problems, and they essentially said to us that technology is how we're going to address these problems, right? We don't need to think about the difficult politics of mobility, of transportation. as long as we can develop these new technologies and integrate them into the system, that will solve it, right? We'll solve all of these problems that people have with transportation, with the auto-oriented, auto-dominated transportation system we have today, where most people rely on cars to get around. And they said, we don't need to fundamentally upend this. We can just add these new technologies to it, and that will solve the problem. And I think, as I said, after these 10 or 15 years, we can see that they haven't really succeeded in following through on that promise.
So then do we just need to give them a little bit more time? I mean, companies like Google, it's not just tech-first companies, right? It's also vehicle-first companies, and it can be easy to sort of forget or obscure how certain industries are transforming and should also be thought of, I think, just like cognitively or whatever as a tech company. So companies like Google, GM, Ford, Tesla, and a company I learned about called Zoox, Z-O-O-X. They've promised self-driving cars, and with them eliminating traffic fatalities, as you point to. So that promise is a big one. Rush hour traffic, no one likes that. And parking lots. Parking lots is something we can pick up on as well. So given that to date we haven't delivered, is that tech failure or something else that's going on?
Well, I think it's a mix of things, right? If we're thinking about failures. But I think that the core of it is that even if they were given more time, just relying on technology couldn't solve these problems, right? We were told that Uber was going to fix these problems because it was going to introduce a ride-hailing system, that autonomous vehicles were going to solve problems with traffic and, human deaths on the road and things like that. There were going to be flying cars. There were going to be tunnels under cities that were going to basically eliminate traffic, right? And I think that what we've really seen is that it's not a lack of time. It's a lack of really understanding how entrenched some of these problems are, and that they really require political solutions to take them on. And so if we think about a company like Uber is an example I like to use because, it's one that's had a really tangible effect on cities that you can really see, right? You don't need to really imagine it. And in Uber's early days, there was a promise that it was going to be complementary toward public transit systems, that it was going to reduce traffic in cities, that it was going to be more efficient, that it was going to be more environmentally conscious, that it was going to open up transportation to people who aren't currently served by the transportation system, right? Who are kind of stuck with really long bus rides, who don't have good access to mobility. And what independent researchers found several years on from these services really rolling out in cities around the world is that they weren't able to fulfill that promise as much as they told us they were going to. And they made it hard to get access to the data for researchers to actually figure that out. But when they were actually able to do that work, they found that in cities where Uber rolled out, traffic got worse, not better. They found that the main people who tended to benefit from these services were young people who were college educated, who lived in cities, and in a city like Toronto, the research shows that it's people who earned over $100,000 a year. These were the people who were mainly benefiting from the service, right? It created more carbon emissions than the trips that it replaced. It took people away from public transit rather than, acting complementary to it. And so all of these promises that were made about the service, how it was going to contribute to cities, how it was going to make things better, were not realized. And so I would argue that when we look at these solutions that are focused on technology as the way that we solve the transportation problem, we would see that again and again, right? Because it doesn't get to the core, the root of the problem, which is political decisions that have been made over the course of many decades that have given us the system that we have today, and ultimately we're going to need political action and political will to fix those things.
I like it. For my third question, we could get closer towards what I was going to build towards, which is more around the agenda for reform and change, which we will get there. But let's talk about how Silicon Valley might be getting something wrong about the future of transportation. But is the government also, and I'll bring in Canadian government there. So we are in the midst of a municipal election, which I find so easy to forget because it's a little bit of a snooze in Toronto. But we're not talking about autonomous vehicles. We are talking about things like, do we need more dedicated bus lanes, and can we pull that off, and how is that a mobility solution? We're also experimenting with interventions like e-bike rebates to, not that e-bikes are autonomous, That would be a scary ride, but potentially fun.
They
but
told us they were going to do that, though.
Is that on its way?
Autonomous e-bikes. It's totally not
That's
on
called
its
a
way.
roller coaster, right? We've been here before. No, I'm kidding around. So, other interventions to nudge us towards maybe other mobility solutions kind of in the space. But do you, through your research, through your criticism and commentary, are you finding that the state is too susceptible to some of what we're being sold on narratively? And is there a stronger or better or different role for the policy aspect that we can chat about for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a serious problem, right? Like the book focuses a lot on tech companies, but it does also talk about governments and the role of governments and what governments have done historically, but also in this period, right? And I think that we've been in this period now for several decades where the narrative has been that the government should do less, that more should be left to the private sector, that we should rely on the private sector to solve these really serious problems that we have, even if it's, complex issues like transportation that I think really require a state role in order to take care of. But the tech companies offered governments a way to step back and to say, we don't need to step into this space because these tech companies are going to address the problem for us, right? We don't need to have these difficult political conversations, make these difficult political decisions, because all we need to do is wait a few more years and autonomous vehicles are going to be here, or these other technologies that the tech industry was promising and was saying that these will solve the really serious issues that we have in the transportation system, right? And so I think that a lot of governments kind of bought into that, at least for a while, and that delayed a necessary conversation about our cities and the transportation that we have in cities and how we actually solve these really serious problems. And so I think that, it's starting to move in that direction. We're starting to talk more about those sorts of things. But I think that the tech companies worked to delay that conversation, to disrupt that conversation. I certainly point to Elon Musk as someone who contributed a lot to that and still does. If you look at proposals for the Hyperloop, for example, which is supposed to be this really fast, better than a high-speed train, essentially. And in California in 2008, they were moving forward with the high-speed rail proposal, and Elon Musk proposed a Hyperloop instead and said, we shouldn't be building high-speed rail because we should be waiting for this technology that doesn't exist before we actually address these problems. Now, there have been issues with the high-speed rail system, but it's not related to the fact that it's a high-speed rail system, right? And we can see that high-speed rail systems to really make important differences to transportation between cities. But there are many other examples as well where, these companies have really stepped in, have said, we can solve this problem, so you don't need to make investments in transit, you don't need to think about how we distribute street space, all these other really important political questions.
So to politics, another connection you make quite strongly in the book is with regards to the ideology of tech, citing, of course, the California ideology or the Californian ideology, which I think you should refresh us on,
Sure.
and pointing to that connection to right-wing economic policies, which I think is a great and really important connection to make. Let's plug in there, and then I want to go to one of my other favorite institutions, universities in the post-secondary sector and the research sector, and we're going to talk about their role here too. So that's coming up next.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks for the preview.
You're welcome. It's good to prime.
Totally.
Now
totally.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Get you
Okay.
thinking.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think it's really interesting, right? Because I talk about this notion of the Californian ideology, which really comes from this paper that was written by Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron back in the 90s, or maybe it was even 80s, I believe it was. And they essentially talk about how this particular idea that is dominant in Silicon Valley really comes to be. And they identify three key points to that. The first is, a real kind of idea that we need to be focusing on personal responsibility, individual empowerment that come out of the counterculture and particular libertarian ideas in the 1960s, and how that really influences Silicon Valley, a particular approach to technology. At that period, the real kind of narrative behind this, which was pushed by Apple in particular, was that, there were these mainframe computers in the past. They really empowered, the major corporations, the hierarchical organizations in society, And instead, what we're going to have is personal computers that give the power to the individual, right? And so there's this idea that technology could be used to empower the individual. This could be really key to it. Then linked to that, when we move into the 1980s, as I was saying, there's this particular neoliberal ideology that really takes hold in that period. So, starting with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but certainly it influences a lot of other countries and the politics of those countries, that, we really need to rely on the private sector to solve these problems, not the government, the state sector, the public sector. And the tech industry, of course, is one that exists because of the public sector, because of a lot of public funding that really started to roll during the Second World War and during the Cold War into promoting the development of these technologies, this industry. But in that period, in the 80s and 90s, there's a real effort to distract from that history, right? To kind of write that out of the narrative of Silicon Valley and act as though this is something that is very kind of entrepreneurial, very kind of private sector, right? This is where all of this technological development comes from, and we shouldn't have the public sector involved with it. And then the third piece of that is really this idea that, we should rely on technology to solve these problems rather than the politics, right? And so these ideas, this kind of focus on individual empowerment, these particular kind of libertarian ideas linked with neoliberal economics, this focus on the private sector, and of course the techno-determinism, the idea that we just rely on technology to solve problems. These really come together and they influence a lot of Silicon Valley ends up doing and still does today, really.
Your analysis of that in the book really got me thinking about, what would the Canada ideology kind of be, right? Or what is it, right? What are we articulating through our policies? And partially, I think it would be a little bit more rooted in public investments in research, right?
Absolutely.
Canada is pretty good at making those investments in R&D. We're proud of that history. We will not stop talking about Hinton and AI, right? But that's part, it's a part of our heritage as well, something we did really well with. You touch on research funding in the book as well. You make really great points that we're now funding less in basic research, and we're much more focused on research that can be easily commercialized. Do you observe that, that research kind of infrastructure is being a little bit too skewed to the rapid road to not nowhere, but to commercialization and monetization, given that we're investing so far less and so much less from a historical context in basic research? And is that part of what needs to change going forward?
Yeah, it's not that we're not doing it, right? There's still a lot of basic research funding that goes out there that is focused on research that is not directly targeted toward rapid commercialization, right? How are we going to commercialize this in the next few years? But there has been a shift away from that as these ideas of commercialization, how do we commercialize this research, really kind of influence what gets done. Especially in the tech sector, but many other sectors as well, especially as governments and institutions are seeking ways to make additional revenue from the research that is being done. There's a greater focus on commercialization rather than just doing the research over a long period of time. And I think that there's an idea that I think has become rather common in recent years, that it seems like innovation has slowed down, right? It seems that we're not developing things as quickly as we used to, as what we perceive as technological development is more and more new technologies, new digital technologies, things that are associated with the internet. Certainly we still see some biotechnological developments, medical, things like that, because there is still a lot of investment that goes into those areas. But I think that it's an issue, right? And I think that it shows, again, like as we've been talking about, as there's this greater reliance on the private sector, this idea that things should be solved in the private sector, there's less of a role or perceived role for the state, that these important investments don't get made. And that we can see that it's not just relying on the private sector is not ultimately going to solve these really serious problems that we have in society. There's still a role for the state in doing that. And transportation is a really obvious example, but there are many others as well.
Of course. If I could summarize your book in 5 words, I tried to. Electric cars are still cars.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
I don't know what grade I would get on that, but I would toss that out there.
I think it's a good summation,
Thanks.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Give me another button.
Yeah.
So Another aspect in talking about autonomous vehicles, and I'm glad you pointed to, the pace of innovation. Maybe it feels like we're not going fast enough, but I think a lot of aspects of AVs feel so new. So a couple of weeks ago, when we were reading that one of my favorite companies to think about in Canada, Loblaw, was going to have autonomous trucks just kind of carting things around, it really felt like, whoa, where did this come from? And that kind of spurred many people kind of Googling and checking out the Ontario government's 2006 policy on autonomous vehicles and kind of what we're doing there and learning more. But you do a great job going back even more in time, very, even more than Wikipedia does sometimes. So can you tell us more about how we were envisioning electric vehicles back in the 1930s? Because I'd love to tie that back to government and interventions and how some governments are either in collaborating with companies. I do a lot of previewing of where we're going, just give you a break too. I'm like, thanks, Vass, all right. A lot of companies are, through state-led intentions, these are goals, let's see if we meet them, but we're setting goals around, all new cars are going to be electric vehicles by a certain year. And I also want to touch on, is that productive or what are we missing? And does that tie back to these are still cars point, right? Anyway, take us to the 1930s. Let's go way back.
Sure. And I would just briefly pick up on your point about, things not seeming to move fast enough, right?
Yeah.
I feel like in some areas,
just
it feels
inflation.
like things are moving. Yeah. It feels like things are moving too fast, right? I think if you think about some digital technologies, the rollout of digital technologies, how things can be changing in that sector, it can feel like, there's a lot of new things that we have to get used to, a lot of new ways of doing things when it's related to digital tech and how that's transforming some aspects of society. But then if you think of other aspects of society, are we moving fast enough to address climate change? Are we moving fast enough to address poverty or housing or hunger or these other really serious issues? Feels like things probably aren't moving nearly fast enough in those areas. And why is that? Does it have something to do with where investment is put, where public investment is put as well? I think important questions. Maybe we should be moving faster on some things and not so fast on some others that would give us time to regulate them properly, assess them properly before they, hit the public, right? Your question on electric cars.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, right? Because if there is, if we're thinking about transportation technologies, if there is a technology that the government is putting a lot of effort into right now, it's very much electric cars, right? There's a lot of money going to automakers, going to battery companies, even to a certain degree to mining companies to incentivize this shift toward electric cars. They're not new, right? As you said, they've actually been around since the late 1800s. And for a while, there was a real question as to whether the automobile would be powered by the battery, by the internal combustion engine, or by the steam engine. These were things that were playing out in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and ultimately, we know that the internal combustion engine is what won out over the other technologies. But now, the battery is coming back, and it looks like that is potentially going to be like what the future of the automobile is going to be, how we power it. But I think that there's a really real question as to whether it solves the fundamental problems that we're being told that it should solve, right? The promise is that by moving to electric cars, we're going to solve the problem of climate change with transportation, with the transportation system. And I think that it will play an important role in reducing the emissions of the transportation system. But I don't think it fully does that, right? And I also think that there is an issue with the supply chain that we don't often talk about when it comes to electric cars, which is that these are still cars, and that means they're very mineral intensive. And when we shift from the internal combustion engine to the battery, there's a lot of minerals that need to be mined in order to make those batteries. Some of that mining will happen in Canada. We're already seeing pushback to that from Indigenous groups, from other groups, whether it's in Quebec, here in Ontario with the Ring of Fire, in BC, up north, all around. But much more of that mining will happen in the global south, where it's kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of us. But it causes a lot of environmental damage and human harm and many of the other issues that I think that when we think about a climate transition and a just transition, that we would want to really be part of that discussion as well. We'd want to address a lot of those problems, a lot of those harms too, not just the climate impacts of what our transportation system does or other aspects of society. And of course, it also doesn't change, how we build communities in a way that is really not great for the environment, that is really unsustainable. So there are a lot of issues with that. I think electric cars have an important part to play in a transition to a cleaner transportation system. But I think that focusing too much on electric cars leaves us not addressing the core of the problem, which I do think is the automobile itself.
Don't forget, electric cars are still cars. You also, I actually didn't know about this fallacy before, the fallacy of induced demand, and you remind us of that in the book a little bit.
Yeah.
Could you touch on that for a second?
Of course, yeah. And, it's a concept that's very common to transportation planners, urban planners, things like that. And that's basically this idea that when you make investments in transportation, for example, you're going to encourage people to use those means of getting around. So if you put a lot of investment, a lot of infrastructure behind automobiles, behind cars, it's no surprise that people are then going to use cars to get around. Whereas then if you take street space away from cars, or give street space to transit, make bike lanes, make cycling lanes, put more investment in other forms of transportation, it's no surprise then that people start to get around in those ways instead. So if we think about, switching the ways that people move right now, changing our transportation system and how people move, that's a really key part of the conversation.
I don't feel bad that I hadn't heard about that before, because I'm not a transportation planner. And apologies if anyone in the audience is like, Vass, you're back to the easy questions.
Well, and it does come up from time to time, right?
Yeah.
Because it's something that Elon Musk likes to bring up as well, to say that it's something that doesn't exist, and so that we shouldn't be worried about placing greater investment on cars, building tunnels under our roads that are only for cars and things like that, because induced demand doesn't actually exist, and so making these greater investments in automotive infrastructure isn't going to make a difference in further encouraging that.
I'm so glad you had brought up critical minerals just earlier, and that it's here in the book. Putting aside for a second how ordinary minerals must feel, that suddenly critical minerals are so important. To a certain extent, all minerals are critical and do really cool things, so shout out to minerals. But I think it's a really important element of the future of mobility that's too often overlooked. Is there anything else you want to say about some of the supply chain ramifications and kind of economic restructuring associated with focusing more on these minerals? You touched on also indigenous politics and mining, and also things being out of sight potentially, but I just want to crack open that door too before we move on.
Sure thing, yeah. I can certainly talk a little bit more about it, because I do think it's really important, right? What is really being proposed right now is that we should really undertake this radical transformation in the transportation system, which we do need to do to address the climate crisis, to address many other problems in the transportation system. But we're told that the way that we should solve this issue is by replacing many of the cars that are on the road today with electric vehicles, and this will be the means that we do it, right? And that will require a significant degree of mining that I think is often left out of those conversations. I think it's interesting to me that, it's not necessarily a surprise that our federal and provincial governments are desiring to move in this direction, because there's a lot of jobs that are dependent on the auto industry, on producing automobiles, on producing parts for automobiles, and all this sort of thing. And, you wouldn't want to see those industries go away necessarily, and it looks very good for politicians to promote these industries as well. But 75% of global mining companies are also headquartered in Canada, so I'm sure there's a lot of kind of lobbying pressure being put on to see this as the means of a transition, right? Because there are a lot of economic interests that are interested in seeing this be the future of transportation. And just to give a stat on the implications of this, the International Energy Agency estimated that if we are to make this transition where we're very focused on just replacing cars that exist today with electric cars and not getting people out of cars as much as we really should, that will mean a 4,200% increase in the mining for lithium that needs to occur by 2040 in order to construct all these vehicles and the batteries for those vehicles, over 2,100% for cobalt, which is a mineral that primarily comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which funds rebel groups, which is associated with child labor. There's a ton of issues there, and that's been connected to many of the major auto companies, electronic suppliers, really. And lithium is a mineral that is abundant, that is in many places, but one of the places where it's likely much of this production is going to happen is in South America, where it's going to mean a lot of impacts on water supplies, on access to water for communities around it. And so there are really real implications to the type of transition that we choose. And my point is not that we don't need electric vehicles, right? We will need electric vehicles for whatever transition we do, but we need to think about where the minerals come from those vehicles, and also how we have a transition where we minimize the amount of mineral and inputs that we need in order to change how we get around, so we can minimize the harm that comes of it as well.
I want to touch on, so we're talking about, where we've been, kind of where we're going. And I think two aspects that are very true about this moment that we're currently in, though it's sometimes hard to appreciate, are two kind of related contexts that you mentioned. You're like trying to guess them. Vass, just say it. The shut-in economy, which I felt like a bit seen with that. I'm just saying that as a joke. And the Internet of Landlords.
Yeah.
So, two situations that I think maybe in the late 1800s, the 1930s, we weren't daydreaming was going to be a part of our future, but we didn't get a jetpack. This is what we got. Tell us what these economies are and kind of how they're changing society in our cities.
Yeah, it's quite important, right? And the shut-in economy, it's from an article written by Lauren Smiley in 2015, I believe. And it's fascinating because I talked to her about it, and she was like, I was living outside of San Francisco in another part of California, and then I moved back, and I saw just how much people lived had changed in that short period of time, because a lot of these apps and these services that have become ubiquitous kind of hit San Francisco first, right? Because it was developed by people in San Francisco naturally. And so, the shut-in economy is this idea that people will spend a lot more time at home or to some degree at work, and they'll have more and more of what they need delivered to them and not actually go out into the world so much. And, if you think about it, during the pandemic, I was like, man, the shut-in economy, that was pretty, it looks like how a lot of people are living today if you don't consider the delivery workers who are not shut in and who are out making all those deliveries, right? And one of the things that Lauren talked about in that piece that really kind of struck me and stood out to me was that when we look at the implications of the shut-in economy, there's a much clearer divide between the served and the servants, right?
Yep.
The people who are at their homes, who are working these well-paid jobs, who are getting everything delivered to them, and then the people who are outside, who are running all those deliveries, who are having their rights, kind of decimated, who are getting paid very poorly for doing this work, and they're delivering all these services that allow these, in many cases, tech workers, in the case of San Francisco, but other types of professional workers as well, to keep doing these types of jobs. And, what Lauren was observing was this happening in San Francisco in 2015, but I think it's something that's become a lot more common in many cities around the world as these services have further rolled out, and as tech companies have sought to, encourage us to spend more time online, spend more time working, and to utilize these services more, right? Rely more on the deliveries so you can keep doing whatever you want. And I think that also has implications for cities, right? If we think about what it means then for people to not be out in the city as much, to not be going to restaurants, to not be going to shops, there's less of an incentive for them to remain open, whereas then you have delivery workers who are doing all these things, and that has led to some degree, the development of these things called dark kitchens, where instead of having a restaurant where, it has a street presence, where you can walk by it, where you can go in, there's still food being prepared, but there's not that same life to the city as a result, because you don't need to, visit this space because it's just for delivery people. And that there's a development that does that with stores as well. And then the other piece, the Internet of Landlords. I think is really important. Jathan Sadowski is the one who wrote about this. And it's essentially this idea that as these digital technologies move into our life more and more, that they always seem to demand a rent, right? There's always a price that needs to be paid for using these services. And so as more and more things get facilitated through digital technologies, all of these companies are looking to get a piece of everything that's happening, right? They want more services, more transactions that happen through their platforms so they can take a bigger piece of everything that's happening in the economy, especially if they can find things that didn't have a price previously and add it to it, or, have it so that you access it through an app or whatnot, and then they can get something from it, whether it is, a price that you pay with dollars or whatnot, or it's a price that you pay in data by, giving off your data for free to these services and allowing them to connect it.
That's why we need libraries. Okay. So something else that I meant to connect to the critical minerals question is, and you touched on this, but the mining industry and how they've been going driverless. So is this as a way to test the innovation? Is this a mechanism to save money on labor, or a little bit of both? Can you maybe just illuminate for us, that area where they are maybe a little bit a step in the future in terms of how they're using the technology of autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, you do see that in some industries, right, where you don't really have to interact with a whole load of people. It's much more difficult to drive autonomously down a street with a computer because you have all these other things that are going on around it, other vehicles, people, cyclists, all of this activity that's happening. Whereas if you have a driverless vehicle on a mine site, there's much fewer distractions, there's much fewer chances for some kind of negative encounter as a result. And so you do see mining companies adopting it. You see oil companies like in Alberta adopting these big, kind of driverless tractors and things like that, dump trucks. In that case, it's really an effort to reduce labor costs, right? To get rid of people who they were paying often quite high salaries, to reduce the cost of having to do that.
Something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well, right? Because you mentioned Loblaws and the rollout of trucks, and we often see these companies do these experiments with these driverless solutions. And sometimes the question is really, is this something that's going to make a big difference? Is it something that's going to be adopted broadly? And I think that we can see that happening in say mining and oil and things like that. But I'm still questioning whether it's going to be a large-scale thing in the case of Loblaws, right? Because we've been hearing this since 2014, that these driverless trucks were going to replace a ton of people. We just had the CEO or co-founder of one of these big autonomous truck companies found guilty of fraud the other day.
Maybe Zoox.
This one was Nikola, of course, because Elon Musk started Tesla, so why not be very uncreative and start an autonomous truck company called Nikola as well to go along with it. But there's the question between is it making a real difference, or is it kind of like a PR move to look innovative? And I still feel that that's kind of the case with the Loblaws thing. But maybe I'll be wrong and they do use them much more often, but we'll see.
The context is also so important, right? With trucking, it's an industry that we've eroded very much over time, right? Used to be a stronger kind of more middle-class job. Now it's more often than not, an independent contractor context. People are paying out of pocket for more things, at times even renting their own trucks. So to gesture at that industry and say, well, actually, soon there won't even be humans, and then we won't have to deal with these rules that people need a rest after a time, and they'll be better drivers. I think that context right now with labor shortages could also create more space and demand to kind of advance those technological solutions. I'm using a lot of scare quotes.
Absolutely, but like the argument is, don't push for better labor protections,
right? Just let
tech
deal with it.
Exactly, because if you do gain better wages, if you do gain better protections, we're just going to wipe you out with the technology that surprisingly hasn't arrived after 8 years of promises. But the kind of threat of it is always kind of looming.
I've two more juicers for you, and then I'm going to start turning it to the audience. So the first is a little bit of a wild card. You get to pick from two questions, actually.
Okay, all right.
No, two questions overall, but now you get to pick.
Okay.
Okay, the first one. You've mentioned Elon Musk quite a few times. So if you want to go this direction, you can tell me what you would say if you were in the metaverse and you met up with Elon Musk, or you're stuck with him in an elevator, because he's often a person that you're thinking about and critiquing, and he's a huge part of these conversations.
Yep.
So let us know.
For better or worse.
For better or for worse. And the other one is, have you ever been worried about regulatory capture for yourself? You are a very critical voice of autonomous vehicles. Are we going to get to a point where Zoox is calling you up to be their resident thought leader, etc.? I'm joking a little bit, but this happens quite a bit, sometimes as a tactic to extinguish voices that can be seen as oppositional. If you want to answer both, you absolutely can, but where should we go?
I think the second one is more interesting.
Okay.
Because I don't know if what I would say to
Because
Elon
that's private.
Musk
That's
is,
between you and Elon.
Well, I also think it's probably not appropriate for a
For the stage.
library
Oh, wow.
discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's go with the second one.
Sure.
Do you want to ask something more? Should I respond briefly?
No.
We can get into it.
Yeah, you've
Cool.
you've chosen wisely. Take that question, and then
Yeah,
we'll round out.
I think it's the more interesting question.
Okay.
We can always talk about Elon Musk.
Yeah.
I do too much. I think that's the more intriguing one. And I would say, these offers may come along, right, to go to industry or whatnot. It's really not something that I'm interested in, because my kind of job, as I see it, is to provide the critical voice and to provide a platform for other people who have critical voices to kind of reach a broader audience with them, right? And I think that, if I did engage in that way with the tech companies, it would kind of diminish that and take it away. And certainly there's always a desire to do that. It's quite common for tech companies to hire their critics and kind of extinguish those voices. But, I don't have to do that. I have the support of listeners of the show who allow me to continue being a critic. I do some academic work as well. So I don't really see the need to go off and take the money in that way.
No, not that you see the need, but just if you ever feel the tension, if it happens. No, it's a great answer. Don't worry.
I don't-
Job interviewing you now.
I know, but I know what you're saying. I feel like it would be like a betrayal of what I believe in. And I don't have to betray that at the moment, so why would I?
Don't betray it. I wasn't asking you, will you? What is the price? Okay, yeah. I'm getting the signal. I know we're turning it to you, but look, I have to ask, right? Last time we were chatting about largely sidewalk labs or backyard. Now we're talking about streets. You have a full agenda that we could have spent the whole time talking about how we actually get to take back our streets with more democratic power, getting better control over new and emerging technologies. But can you just touch on a couple of tactics that we should be thinking about as engaged citizens, as people that care about these issues? How can we be better involved in shaping the direction of where everything's going?
Sure. It's a good question and a tough one too, right? Because it can be difficult to get into those things, to engage with those things. For me, if I was thinking of real solutions to these problems, and if we're thinking in kind of two directions, the transportation system, but also broadly, about the tech industry and how we kind of take that on, I would say there are multiple things that we need, of course. But I would say if we're thinking about our cities, and we really want to solve these really long-standing problems, these problems that we all recognize exist in the transportation system, and that the tech companies also realize exist, right, and use that as the justification for the technologies that they're promoting, that we really need a role for the state to step in to make these serious investments that we need to make in the transportation system. I think one of the things I tried to do in the book was to show how the system we have today, where many people are reliant on automobiles, is really the result of public investment, right? Of public investment in highways and roads and changing building codes and changing, the ways that cities are planned in order to promote suburban development and all these sorts of things, right? It didn't just happen overnight. It was something that happened because the government made particular decisions, created a set of rules, created investments in particular ways to have that happen. And so if we want to have a transportation system that works in a different way, we need the government to make some different decisions that will require us as a public to push them to make those decisions, because they certainly have a lot of other voices in their ear that are trying to get them to do different things. But that will mean greater investment in public transit. It will mean greater investment in cycling infrastructure so people can feel safe when they cycle, but they also know they can store their bike somewhere and it won't get stolen, right? These things that we don't often always think about when it comes to these issues and these problems. And then I would say also we also need public transit that connects up cities, right? So whether it's bus services, whether it's trains, high-speed rail from Windsor to Quebec City, for example, these real investments that give people alternatives to cars so they don't need to rely on cars, that make them reliable, affordable, dependable. So that's really important. Then if we were looked more broadly at tech as a whole, I think that we need a lot more focus, a lot more investment into technological assessment, right? What is going on with these technologies? What is their likely impact actually going to be? And then how does that inform how we respond to them as a public, but also how governments can respond to them instead of, just having this common narrative that, the government can't keep up, it doesn't have the expertise. The government can build that expertise in order to be able to properly respond to technologies, in order to regulate them properly. And I think that's something that we need a lot more of.
Well said. Thank you so much for your book. Thank you to our audience for being so patient.